assumption is that good language is the best communication. And that's a rhetorical model, a model that takes into account who's talking, who's listening, the context, how people want to represent themselves and identify themselves. In this rhetorical model, it's a radically different assumption of what language is. And it is an assumption that is much more closely aligned to the modern understanding of language. So what I do to get my students to look at language variation and then eventually tackle ideas of good and bad language is go through a process like you see number 2 in the handout on page 2. There's many, many different kinds of bits of language you can do and look at to go through this process. These are just some very tame examples. What I do is I move from things that are very common, things that are unstigmatized, things no one thinks would have any correctness or incorrectness to them simply because they're so normal, and I move down to things that are slightly more irregular, perhaps grammatically, perhaps socially, and then move on to things that are more stigmatized, trying to show along the way that it is language variation. At every point, that language variation is part of what's going on, all right? So if you turn over and look at number 3 on the handout, here we're going to be looking into the past tense. With number 3 on the handout, I want you to consider all of these verbs, all right? Verb. This is where you're actually going to have to do something to move. What I want you to do is consider these verbs, and these are regular past tense verbs. So what you have here are 12 verbs. What I want you to do is say them out loud, and not just out loud, but I want you to do something to them. I want you to put them into the past tense. And so this is something you have to do. And you can't whisper, because if you whisper, you mess everything up. All right? So what you need to do is take a verb like drip, and what we're going to do is put it in the past tense, and the past tense of drip is going to be good. Now, you take a look at the 3 columns there. You got 3 columns. You got a ch column, you got a d column, and you got an id column. Now, in the ch column are going to end up 4 verbs. And there's going to be 4 verbs in the d column and 4 verbs in the id column. So go ahead and do that right now. Go ahead and say these out loud. So for example, we had drip, that's going to go in the ch column. Where is knit going to go? Id. So we had knitted. What about kick in the past tense? In the ch column. So score will be what in the past tense? J. Okay. Go through and sort these out right now. Linguists call this a meta-linguistic awareness of your past tense. We'll avoid such terms. Now you can't whisper, because if you whisper, you're going to mess it all up. And don't look at spelling either, because spelling sometimes is not your friend. All right? In this kind of case especially, spelling is not your friend. So for something like number 10, cry, that's going to go in which column? D. All right? And side is going to go in id, and flex is going to go in t. Good. All right. Now what you got to take account of is this. What's going on here? This is something that all English varieties have. If they have a past tense form, some don't, but if they have an overt, something you can hear and write down, an overt past tense form, they're going to follow this kind of pattern. Is this a random thing that people do? Like on Mondays it's a ch day and Tuesdays it's a d day? No. This is also not divided by social groups. It's not like there's ethnic groups that follow one versus the other. And this is important because these are not stigmatized. You have an ed form which is written as one thing, but in your mind, ever since you were infants, found out and has been categorized in 3 different past tense forms. And you've been sorting these all out by a very regular system. If you take a look at the verbs in that column, what I want you to listen to are the sounds. The sounds. So the sound of drip. Everybody take your hand. It doesn't matter your left or your right hand, so don't get confused up front here. Take your left or your right hand, put it on your own throat, put it on your voice box. I want you to say out loud, go ahead. Now I want you to say out loud, buh. With a book, you get vibrations. For linguists, these are two different kinds of sounds. One is lacking the voice, it's the whispered one. And one has the voice, it's the voiced one. The ch column, the final sounds of all those verbs are voiceless. And in the j column, the final sounds of all those verbs are voiced. So here's the question. In, let's say, kindergarten, maybe second grade, depending on where you went to school, did any kind of language mobile come around and teach you the voiceless voice thing? Did you ever have to learn this formally? No. All bits of language variation of this kind are learned as regular part of language. Now, we'll find out that some of them might be stigmatized, but they're all learned the same way because we're all human. The id column is a small bit of an exception. With the id column, what you have is a similar sound at the end of those verbs. What similar sound do you have at the end of those verbs? Right. So you have ch and j. And there's just a little factor here. Try to say it without the id. So try to say nitch or something like sakada. It just doesn't flow too well. So what you have is your mind making a little repair about how it works. Now, past tense verbs are not all regular. Some of them, as you know, are irregular. So if you take a look at number 4 in the handout, what I have my students do here is fill out what kinds of verbs they have. And up front in number 4, they're all in pretty good agreement about what they have. So for example, I don't know where he lost it, but he found it by the sofa. I don't mind if it makes noise now, but last night I certainly minded. So what you have here is two things that rhyme in their infinitive form, find and mind, but in the past tense, they have all kinds of different patterns going on. One's regular and one's irregular. So as you go down those, students will note that there's all kinds of oddities. And what you can tell your students is that even the irregular ones, way back in the days, back in the old English days, used to be regular patterns, but they've become fossilized, they've become lost throughout the period, and they're simply now memorized chunks.